Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for Abolition Labor, the Fight to End Prison Slavery. I'm Sarah Watson, the director of the Joseph S. Murphy Institute at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Today's discussion is our last program of the fall semester, and we look forward to having you all back next semester, so stay tuned for emails with details about upcoming spring 2025 programs. I'm thrilled to welcome Ayuba Thomas and Andrew Ross, authors of the new book, Abolition Labor, the Fight to End Slavery. And hold on. All right, let's try this one. Check. All right. Little bit of glitches. All right. I'm thrilled to welcome Ayuba Thomas and Andrew Ross, author of the new books, Abolition Labor, The Fight to End Prison Slavery, and Calvin John Smiley, moderator for today's program, and author of the recent book, Defund, Conversations Towards Abolition. Thank you for being with us today. I'm also excited to share that we have copies of Abolition Labor and Defund available for SLU students and alumni, and for folks who are not SLU students or alumni, if there are additional copies left at the end of the event, we'll be raffling those off, so hopefully most folks will leave with a book. And if you are an SLU student or alum and you did not get a book when you came in, raise your hand. Someone from the public engagement team will connect with you to make sure you don't leave empty-handed today. I also want to take a moment to thank all the folks at SLU whose work is making today's event possible. Michael, Nadia, and Rose from the public engagement team, the communication team, especially Aaron, who's running AV, SLU's IT team, and the operations and facilities team, especially Hector and Marta. Before I turn things over to Calvin, a couple notes about audience Q&A. We'll have time for audience Q&A, and you can share your questions by submitting them written on the sheets of paper that have been handed out or live by raising your hand. And we ask that folks keep their questions to about a minute, and we'll take a few questions at a time to allow that many folks who want to share can. It's my pleasure to welcome Calvin John Smiley, who's moderating today's program. I had the opportunity to work with Calvin while we were colleagues at Hunter College. Smiley is an associate professor of sociology at Hunter College, and he's the author of two recent books, Defund, Conversations Towards Abolition, and Purgatory Citizenship, Reentry, Race, and Abolition. Smiley's writing has appeared in the Journal of Human Behavior and the Social Environment, the Prison Journal, and Punishment in Society. And his research has been featured in the Washington Post, The Guardian, Toronto Star, and Le Monde. Outside of writing, Smiley works with incarcerated youth and young men in New York City, and he lives in Queens. Oh, yes, silence your phones. All right, thank you, and I'll turn things over to Calvin.
First of all, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and welcome Andrew and Ayuba, and thank you all for being here at the CUNY School of Labor. I'm really excited to be in conversation with both of you about the book. I'm just going to say a couple things. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to say a couple very quick things. I'm going to turn it to you guys if you have any kind of opening remarks, and then we will have a kind of a conversation, and then we will open it up to the audience. Sound good? All right, awesome. So let me just start by saying Abolition Labor, what I really love about it is that it really reads both as much as a book of history or historical writing, as well as a social science weaving in both an abundance and richness of the historical record, as well as social science methodology, interviewing folks who are system impacted. Much of what I appreciate about this book, as I will highlight in some of the questions, is the relationship with various tensions that the authors address. So, for example, on the one hand, we all can probably recognize how exploitative labor of any kind should be shunned and, as the title addresses, abolished. Yet, on the other hand, that relationship becomes complicated when even the most meager of wages is the difference between nothing and something. Further, it complicates the discussion around short-term and long-term goals when addressing the future of punishment, labor, and prisons. Something for us to think about is a quote that our authors draw from Robert Perkinson's studies of Texas prisons. Quote, "We used to think the South would be more like America, but America has become more like the South." And so in this current moment that we're in, where both things on the local, national, and even international levels are literally becoming more, moving more towards the right and becoming more reactionary. Books such as these are important because important points of reflection and help us push the needle forward towards change. And so with that said, I'll have a lot more to say, but I do want to hand it over to Andrew and Ayuba for just some of their opening or preliminary comments about the book.
Thank you, Calvin and Sarah, and welcome everyone. Let me just say that there were really two reasons why we felt we had to write this book. The first one was we had to tell the story about this national campaign to abolish slavery without exception, and in large part because one of the things we noticed in a recent survey was that 88% of Americans who were polled had no idea that the exception clause was in the 13th Amendment, and that is the clause that authorizes slavery and indentured servitude behind the walls. And that's an astonishing fact. So partly this is about public and political education. The second reason was we wanted to start a new kind of conversation about prison labor because, again, there's a lot of misconceptions in the public mind about not just the content of the labor, but who the labor is for, who the beneficiaries are, who the private and the public profiteers are. So the book's largely based, as Calvin said, largely based on interviews we did, about 100 in-depth interviews with formerly incarcerated men and women in 4 states, New York State, our home state, and then we chose 3 southern states, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas, in part because they're states where there's no compensation, zero compensation for prison labor. In New York, people are paid penny wages from 12 cents, and the top wage for industrial work is 65 cents currently. Those pay scales are unchanged for decades. We also interviewed a lot of advocates in the movement. And one very important thing is we paid a lot of attention to gathering data about work in the informal economy in prison. And these are all of the things that incarcerated people have to do on the side. Everyone has to have a hustle to stay afloat, to stay alive in prison, basically. And there's a multifarious ways of doing that, trades in goods and services. And we count that as labor too, because more often than not, there is as much energy and work expended in generating that extra revenue as in the formal work assignments that pay, penny wages. We're active ourselves in the 13th Forward Coalition here in New York State, which is trying to abolish slavery without exception in New York, and make New York the 9th state to formally do that. Nevada was the last one, last month. This has all happened in recent years. But we feel it's particularly important in New York because the first big win of the organized labor movement in New York in the 19th century was the abolition of private contract prison labor. Over a number of decades of campaigning and then in a state constitutional amendment in 1893. After that big win, the labor movement turned its attention to sweatshops in the garment industry as the new evil to mobilize and organize around. As part of that campaign, we've learned a lot about how legislators respond to the call to support and to launch and support legislation. And you would think that most officials would be quite happy, or at least would congratulate themselves on contributing to removing the stain of slavery from their state constitutions. But you would be wrong. Most officials aren't so eager to do that for all sorts of reasons, but the primary one being, what is the fiscal cost? How much are we on the hook for paying fair wages if we abolish involuntary servitude? And For us, that's not, that kind of question is in direct line of descent from the questions that slaveholders asked after emancipation. How much am I going to have to pay the people who used to pick my cotton for free? In the book, we break down a lot of the costs and the benefits, because legislators usually only look at the costs and fail to look at the benefits. So we lay out in some detail all of the benefits, and they're multifarious, and look at the studies that show there's a net overall benefit to doing this, to passing these measures. But ultimately, and here I'm going to conclude these remarks, ultimately, this isn't a question of cold numbers. The basic human dignity that comes from protecting people from slavery and involuntary servitude can't be calculated in dollar numbers. And it can only be attained once everyone is free to be able to refuse unsafe and ill-paid labor. And that is the crux of this whole issue, the right to refuse ill-paid and unsafe labor. And so, you know, we'd like you to join us in this campaign and taking care of the unfinished business of emancipation, basically, more than 160 years after the Declaration.
Well, to continue on with what Andrew was saying, right now we're at the stage of a campaign. One of the key factors in why we wrote the book, the way we wrote the book, was to mobilize a movement, right? A campaign happens when people go to legislate, when people are having conversations in a room like this. A movement happens on the street. So we wrote it similar to what Calvin was saying, in the context of to deliver some history, but also to be like a social driver, right? We want the average person, like, these fights need to come out of the institution, out of the academia, and hit the streets. And so we wrote it so the lion's share of the people who didn't know about this, the exception clause, would have an idea and would have a reason to join this movement and fight. My name is Ayuba Thomas. I'm formerly incarcerated myself. A big part of us gaining the research came from interviews. And I think that a lot of times the people who are affected the most are left out of the story. So we wanted to add, you know, the stories of the people who were incarcerated, who have been going through this issue of labor. And with this book, we've discovered a few different things, and how important the labor issue really is. It's important for them to get paid on the inside, but it's also important for them to come out with something on the outside, right? And that labor, that payment that we were talking about with 13 Forward and some of the other organizations, that's been fought against, you know, by legislators, by union drivers. You know, it's very, very important, as Andrew was saying, to, one, give a person the dignity to be paid for the work that they do, right? And then also to give them a fighting chance to not have to re-enter back into the system or re-enter into society without, you know, some kind of substantial, I guess, support or some substantial finance to go know that, okay, when I'm going out to look for a job, I have enough money to travel back and forth to look for a job. I have enough money to pay a cell phone bill, to communicate with people who I'm trying to work for, or I'm trying to educate myself. So it's larger than just giving people money and behind the wall. What that does is it also takes away from the double extraction from the community. Because when a person is arrested and incarcerated, they're removed from their family, they're removed from their community. At some point, they were some form of support, whether it was financial, whether it's physical, whether it was just a spiritual guidance, a placeholder. When that's removed from the community and from the family, they suffer. But then they figure out that, amidst the misnomer of they get 3 hots in a cot, that people incarcerated are not taken care of by the state, right? So people want to ensure that their loved ones come home, so they pool up other resources what they're already lacking from and put more back into the prison system. So by paying people in prison, by paying people a fair wage, one, it takes away the power dynamic, which will shut the prisons down. 2, it'll take away a lot of the extra financial responsibility and the stress and the trauma that comes with having to take care of a loved one within prison. So I'll turn it over to Cal right now. Thank you.
Thank you both for that kind of overview of the book. And I think that's really helpful and insightful for where my questions go. So as an academic, I always break things down into different groups. So I would love for us to start with just a couple questions around concepts that are talked about, and then some of the historical context, and then really get into kind of the labor in the future. So the first question I just kind of had, but I'm going to roll it into the second one, or another one as well, is like, how would you define this carceral state, or are we in a carceral state? And how does that look like in terms of concepts or terminology like a prison industrial complex, which we know has some controversy around it, right? Are we actually in a prison industrial complex? How would you respond to those kind of two conceptual terms?
I don't know whether this is a comprehensive definition, Calvin, but I think we're in a warrior state, first of all, and that it's prepared for not just a permanent war economy, but permanently a war. But we're also in a carceral state because a lot of the practices of surveillance and discipline and punishment that were pioneered, if you like, behind penitentiary walls have become much more normalized in society as a whole. We are, and part of this has to do, and there's a labor angle to this, part of this has to do in some cases with the power, the collective power of a lot of the unions that are involved in the security sector, not just correctional guards, police, and so on and so forth, but in the entire custodial and security sector of the economy, which has been one of the big growth areas for organized labor since the late 1970s, it should be said, and these unions exert a lot of power at the legislative level. But those practices, the surveillance, the punishment, the discipline, we've seen these become sort of permeate society as a whole, so that security and armed response have become very normative. And so I think that's what a lot of people mean when they say the carceral state. But
yeah, to add to that, outside of prison, outside of policing, there's the education system. The Board of Education has become very carceral, right? The structure of the buildings, the way the glass is weaved in with barbed wire, the way that they have metal detectors, they are training children to enter into that carceral state. So we as the people that are running things now, we have to make a better choice for our children, right? To get them out of that center of this is what's gonna happen. It happens largely in the Black and brown communities, but it happens in every community. In the state and in the city, it happens. The police are present active within schools. They are present active within juvenile, foster care. So like we've been, leaning towards the heavily policed. And then we're starting people from younger to realize that that's the type of society we live in.
And just to piggyback off that real quick, just a quick story. Yesterday I did career day at a high school in Brooklyn, and when I got to the high school, I was met at the front doors by 2 NYPD officers, not a guidance counselor, not a principal, not a, a teacher, but, and legitimate NYPD, cuffs, mace, the whole regalia. So,
And every campus in the city right now, every university campus in the city, right now you're likely to be, your first line of welcome is going to be security guards or off-duty NYPD cops preventing protests on campus.
Yeah. So just moving a bit into the historical context, you both brought up in your introductions about the 13th Amendment, right, and the exclusionary clause and the exception clause and wage. But I think one thing that you did really well in the book, particularly in chapter 2, the Yankee invention, was to kind of pull apart a bit of the mythology of that, right? And how you write is that the histories of forced labor and punishment go hand in hand even prior to the 13th Amendment. And so can you speak to that a bit for our audience here? And then also just where does not where does the 13th Amendment go, but like how does the 13th Amendment then reinforce that punishment in labor?
Yeah, I think it's a very important history to get a grasp on, and it's not well understood, again, in the public mind. In the public mind, when we think about the worst aspects of prison labor, we have convict leasing in the South in mind, right? The image of the white overseer on a horseback riding shotgun and black convicts with striped outfits and shaved heads and shackled under the hot southern sun. But in fact, all of those elements in that scenario were pioneered here in New York State in the 19th century in the industrial prison labor system. All of them, maybe not the hot southern sun, but everything else. And as I said, the dependence of the New York penitentiary system on that labor in the 19th century was very crucial to the economy. The 13th Amendment, the exception clause, was actually something that had existed for a long time. It was sort of boilerplate language from the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery in the Northwest Territories with the exception of people who were convicted of a crime. And so that language just sort of got passed down and found its way into the 13th Amendment, found itself is a sort of euphemism.
Initially, it was those who were convicted of hard labor.
Exactly.
And then they changed the language to make it blanket to everybody who was incarcerated.
Right, like moral turpitude becomes part of it, which is a kind of vagueness of you were arrested for something.
Yeah, exactly. But it's become less common, of course, for sentences to be handed down with hard labor in them. But there was a difference of interpretation at the time when the 13th Amendment was ratified about what exactly that exception clause meant. And the harshest possible interpretation was the one that won the war of interpretation and was observed by the courts down until the present day. But there are very few states where hard labor is actually still part of the sentence. I think Louisiana is one of them. Maybe Alabama? I think so, yeah.
Was Arizona at one point, or at least Sheriff Arpaio's in Maricopa County, right? Didn't he have something at one point with the chain gangs and the kind of symbolism of putting folks in the pink and black striped uniforms? And so just to move into kind of the labor, head on here. I mean, again, going back to my opening remarks about those tensions, about the differences between the ideals versus the reality. The idea of having the notion of, do we abolish labor or do we unionize labor in these facilities, and what are the differences between, or what are the outcomes of either or? Because I think, pointing out to the interviews you did, there were so many kind of varied experiences that people had, right? So some folks talked about the types of jobs that they wanted versus types of jobs that they try to avoid. Which were the dangerous jobs? Which were the jobs that gave them more autonomy? And so there's all of those kind of complicated narratives that are weaved through. So, where can you tell us, like, in terms of the movement that we're talking about, would there be parts of it that are trying to unionize some of this labor that is happening? Or is it about as you said in the beginning, right, the ability to refuse work if you wanted to?
Well, I think the biggest concept with that is the refusal of work, because what that does is that takes away the power of the correctional officer, and then that omits their need, right? And so if the main reason a correction officer has the power that they have right now is because they can inflict harm, they can inflict punishment for someone not working. Other than that, they would just be security guards, glorified babysitters. So the labor aspect really changes the dynamic of what prison is. If people actually, aside from just getting paid for work, but can refuse work, that's very, very powerful. That's very, very powerful, because the administration won't have a play. Like, they won't have that punitive, the punishment, the punishment attached to it, So, but on the other hand, to pay someone, it's considered reform, but it's on the road to abolition, because it actually, like I said, changes that power dynamic. Then it actually gives a person incarcerated autonomy to decide, like, I want to do this, I want this type of training, instead of, you just got to clean the bathroom, or just get the basic bare, minimum custodial job, just so we're on the books and we're getting our funding still. So, the labor aspect is very important for both, I would say, reform and abolition. When the reform part of it is to, one, not just reform the prison, but reform the people who are incarcerated, to help with some form of rehabilitation. If there's goal-driven, choices behind jobs and things of that changes someone's future. That changes the outcome of, when they come home, the likeliness of them to return to prison. Them being able to support their family, because that's why most people go to prison for the most part anyway, is because they're just trying to survive and trying to support their their family. Andrew likes to say there's the idea that people, I'm sorry, I'm fumbling your words. I'll let you speak on it. But it's the idea that people who work, they have dignity and they have pride. Right, and that trickles out back to society.
Okay, the only thing I would add to that is about the unions themselves. There's a long history of efforts to organize incarcerated people, really going back to Sing Sing in the 1910s. I think was probably the first effort to do that. And then in the 1970s, during the prisoner rights movement, there was a prisoners' labor union, which had chapters all across the country in many, many states. And there was never a successful bargaining contract, or there was no real successful certification, but a lot of cards being signed. And then the Supreme Court in 1977, I believe it was, in Jones v. North Carolina, decided that the prisoners did not have the right to organize. And that was a very consequential legal decision. That said, some of the chapters of the Abolition Slavery National Network, especially New York, have been pushing for the right to organize, along with other parts of the standard labor package. We have a number of bills that we're pushing, one of which is a wages bill. Is anyone here actually who works with 13th Forward? No? Okay, you all should. You're all invited. We have a wages bill that we're pushing right now, that is pushing for half of the minimum wage, and also a commissary bill that has a complicated formula for determining commissary prices. But 13 Forward is probably more unique in that regard across the country for focusing on the labor issues. Unions have not been particularly good in supporting this, this movement. And it really goes back to the 19th century. I mentioned that the big win was, the first big win of organized labor was abolish private contract labor in prisons. But it wasn't done out of solidarity with the workers in the prisons. It was done in order to protect the honest workers on the outside from having to compete with unpaid labor on the inside. And so that principle has been pretty much continuous ever since. So we're not expecting the AFL-CIO to sign on to the Abolish Slavery campaign anytime soon, which is unfortunate, but that is a matter of debate. Places like this especially.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that context. And it leads me to my next question on labor, which is how well you both write about the different types of labor that occur in prisons, and particularly the ideas of the different forms of both generating revenue labor, but also the self-reproducing of the carceral system labor. So just to kind of put that out there for folks, right, the kind of self-generating would be, the self-reproducing is the custodial work, the porter work, the folks who work in the kitchens. But then there's the kind of revenue-generating work, which are the ones that are producing products that go out into the marketplace and are sold for profit. And you do such a great job talking about specifically Alabama with its crops, talking about New York here with Corecraft. But the question I have is, what happens if there's an abolition of labor, in the sense that the reproducing labor, like even if we get rid of the generating revenue labor, is there a way that we end the self-reproducing labor of the carceral system if we still have prisons? Does that make sense?
I see that as a problem, because what happens during strikes, prison strikes, is that the CEOs and the staff, they have to do that labor, and they don't want to do that labor. So if the people who are incarcerated are not forced at this point to take care of that space, then it's going to be an encumbrance on someone else. The tax dollars are going to have to go to cleaning people, or pay a different rate for CEOs for having to add on this duty to their job. So I don't really see it as something that's going to happen like that.
Any thoughts, or should I move on? Okay. So the other question I have about labor is this idea about the underground markets, right? And I think that becomes a really, really important, contextualizing the labor that happens in these places. And it's as you talk about things such as gambling, smuggling goods such as cell phones and other kind of contraband, or even the stealing of products in the facility to be self-sustaining, right? So as you mentioned, talking about getting a kitchen job, not because it's particularly fun work, but it allows you to get extra ingredients so that you can make food on your own. And so, the question I have is, who's involved in this black market, and how important is it to the ecosystem of carceral environments?
Well, I guess Ayub has lived this. I came into it, I'm an educator in the prison education program, so I didn't know so much about it, but the interviews gave us a wealth of material about the workings of this underground economy, which is a major part of the prison economy, but is rarely, the business press lauds it as entrepreneurial, the finest examples of entrepreneurial activity. But it's rarely focused upon, and I think probably the most original part of the book is really delving into that underground economy, which ranges from everything from high-priced contraband to handcrafted goods, making of clothing and jewelry and hair dye and tattoos to provision of services, sex, cleaning cells, laundry, and hairdressing, and so on and so forth. There's no idle time in prison, in a sense, for most people. If you don't have financial support from outside, you have to find the hustle. So a lot of it is easy to romanticize in a way, but a lot of it is also very predatory. And it's something you're forced to do, and it's your hustle, and it accompanies the lousy wage that you get for a formal work assignment. And we came away thinking that this isn't a theoretical book, but if there's one argument that really takes issue with the dominant theory of mass incarceration, that is the theory of warehousing, which some of you are probably familiar with. After deindustrialization, we had this surplus working class. They became warehoused in the nation's penitentiaries. You got the prison boom to house them. They were available to exploit for profit and so on and so forth. But they were sequestered from the rest of society and didn't have an impact necessarily on the economy. We found a lot of continuity between the lousy wage and a hustle on the inside and the lousy wage and a hustle on the outside, which is the mark of a neoliberal economy, that people don't have a living wage, so they have to do something on the side. And that's almost, you know, a lot of middle-class people, teachers, have to have something on the side to survive. The illegal aspects of the hustle, of course, are what captures people inside. And then on the outside, again, once they're released, the same thing applies, a lousy wage and a hustle, which results in the recapture of so many people. And so there's a remarkable amount of continuity we found. And the prison economy is not at all, you know, sequestered from the free world economy in that regard.
And although it is, a lot of those things are deemed to be illicit, a lot of it is just care work. There's substituting for the lack of care that takes place in the facility. These are the people, men and women are joining forces in a sense to make sure that everyone is taken care of. Even though it is predatory, you know, if someone without, you know, you're gonna charge them a little bit more, and you know, and that happens over, and it keeps a person in debt, but the person is able to sustain while they're there, right? And we looked at it largely like, you know, it's a need for this work. Just like similarly to what Andrew was saying, like, you know, there's that gap that needs to be filled. And for those who have, they help fill that gap for those who don't have. So, you know, even though a lot of it can be deemed, well, all of it is considered illegal within the prison walls because you're not supposed to make any exchange. So if I was to make a birthday card for someone to send to their child, I could get a ticket for that. I could get written up for that. I could lose time for that. But they allow it to happen because it keeps the morale up, right? It keeps them off of the CEO's backs. And so, you know, this illegal, just like the society we live in, they allow it to happen, right? Where do the drugs come from? No one's driving to Bolivia to go get drugs. You know, it's dropped off there. So, you know, the same thing with contraband, cell phones, drugs, that all comes in from the outside. So it's part of the system, and it helps the system perpetuate and helps the system keep going on.
Yeah, and I think just to that point, right, it's coming in through administrators, guards, other staff, and it also just, and again, please don't take this out of context, but you almost, not that you feel bad for them, right, but it also is highlighting that they also might be making more money because their wages also aren't that great. Like, it's just like a highlighting of, like, there's a system of a neoliberal state that no one is making good money to survive, and so they're also, I mean, they're greedy, and I mean, yes. I don't like guards, but
especially in Alabama, when we went down to Alabama, right, we realized like it was so much corruption down there, and the only reasons the officers actually work there because they don't have any security, right? The only reason they work there is to make that extra money, right? Their pay is not substantial enough to get them by. It's super dangerous. So for someone to inject themselves into that, it has to be like a massive benefit.
Right, and I think as you also point out, there was also that racial component, right? Where in the South, much of the guards were black, whereas in upstate New York prisons, they're mostly white, rural, racist guys. So in the last couple minutes before we turn it over to Q&A, I just had, not as broad questions, but questions for you both. And I'll start with you, Ayuba, with the last chapter. I really love the last chapter because it's written in a form of an interview where Andrew and your other colleague interview Ayuba about his experience. And I just wanted to first ask you, going into knowing that you guys were going to do it that way, how were you feeling about kind of going from the interviewer to the interviewee in a book that you're an author for? And then your experience as someone who's system impacted, would you say that your experience is unique or universal to others who've also gone through the system? I know it's a lot, but
yeah. No, I'll start with the last part of the question. I do think the way I approached my situation was unique, but I am not alone. There are others who think like me. There are others who want to do the things that I've been able to accomplish, from prison and, after prison, post-prison. So I'm not unique. And we find that a lot of the people who go into prison are actually good people, good business people. They just, making a wrong choice, selling the wrong thing. And so, if you realize a lot of people who come, especially with, I know that I don't want to go too much, but I know one of your questions is education based. The people who come out of prison, they really take education seriously and they excel if they're involved in that. And, so for in that purpose, I'm not unique. But what I will say is that for the book and the research that I've done, it's been pretty unique because of my lens, right? I am formerly incarcerated. I do have lived experience. I'm a researcher, and I'm an academic, but then I'm also an activist, right? So I look at it from all of these different perspectives, and sometimes I even, during doing these interviews, like I omit myself out of the equation, right? I just try to really look at it like an observer, like, just without bias, right? And for me, it's been beneficial to do that sometimes because you get the truth, you get the real deal out of people and you don't miss the story. So like when you're interviewing someone and we come from a similar background and we come from similar experience, we might gloss over the conversation. But my job is to actually get information and draw information out from them, have this conversation with them, but for public knowledge. So I can't have that, like, oh, CEO, the short talk, we need to say correction officer, because some of the people might not know who a correction officer is, right? So the different approaches, and I've had some good training, some help in information. Shannon, she's a great researcher right there, NYU. So, like it's been a little different for me, but other people are capable to do what I've done and to look at things the way I've looked at it.
And then I'll just say before I jump into some of the early questions that we have is, you touched on the education part, but I want to just drive that home a little bit more, because my understanding is you both met through the NYU PEP program, which is the prison education program. Mm-hmm. So how important do you, I think I know the answer to this, but how important do you think education is for folks on the inside to be able to get or at least have availability to? And then do you see education on the inside as a reform or an abolitionist strategy?
I'll just say one thing, but education is the number one thing that stops recidivism. 87% of people who get involved in education do not go back to prison.
I guess I mean, there are abolitionists who believe that prison education is simply enabling the system, and it props it up, and it provides us another service that in most cases the prison authorities don't pay for. I mean, our prison education program is brings money and resources into the prison in order to teach. My experience is that it's not an enabling, but that's just my personal experience. I don't have a big, I don't have something big to say about that. I would say, however, and it relates to the circumstances under which the book was produced, we're kind of unique in the country in that we have a research component of our prison education program, the research lab. So what happens is when some of our guys come out, we bring them into the lab and train them in basic social science research methods, and then we undertake these research projects together, like this one. So we do the interviews together, and that the value-added component is Ayuba's experience in a way, but also we have. You know, we're drawing on our own knowledge as educators within the program. So there's a kind of innovative model, and we call it the peer researcher model. Ayuba doesn't like that term, I know, but
I'm a researcher.
He's a researcher, not a peer researcher. So that really speaks to what's unique about those circumstances, and I think. If you go to our website, I can't remember the URL offhand, but there's a long list of publications and books that have come out of that work.
So I just want to say before I jump into Q&A from this and then what we're going to get from the audience, thank you both for writing this book. Thank you for the CUNY School of Labor for hosting this event. So if we can just do a quick round of applause for that portion. I didn't get instructions. Can I read people's names too? Sure. Okay, I'm going to do that. So the first question, which was an early question, comes from Maria Garcia, and it asks, how do we break the supply chain that feeds prison labor, and how does prison slavery relate with immigration detention?
That's an easy one. By paying people, that kind of breaks the supply chain. If you pay people a fair wage, one, and then two, also give them the right to refuse refuse work, that, like I said, takes the power dynamic away from, the administration, away from the correction officers, and it won't be a need to pull people in. If you have to pay people more, you're not gonna be pulling people off the street as much as you are now. So I think that's an easy fix,
I can answer the second part, or try to, because I think it will become more and more important in the months to come, the years to come, when the promised deportation crusade ramps up under Trump. And in fact, I direct you to a recent book by Silky Shah, S-H-A-H, I can't remember what it's called.
Unbuilt Walls.
Unbuilt Walls, where she really makes a very important argument about how we really have to see the immigrant detention centers as part of the incarceration archipelago. They tend to be siloed in the public mind and also in activist minds, but in many ways there's so much overlap. In a lot of cases, it's the same private managers, the same private profiteers, especially in the South. Similar practices of exploitation and abuse, and a lot of the detainees can be in there from 2 to 5 years. So they're not short sentences. They're not even sentences, of course, but they're very similar in many respects. So that's happening more. I mean, not just on domestic soil, of course. A lot of the detention centers are south of the border. Not just in the Americas, but especially in Europe, where European nations have made agreements with North African nations and with Turkey and other bordering states to set up detention centers in return for aid. The new aid programs are tied to these detention centers.
Yeah. do we want to?
Yeah, we can maybe go to one of the submitted questions, and if there's somebody who wants to ask their question live, please raise your hand, and we'll do that second.
So I saw your hand first, so
Yeah.
go ahead. And then we'll go maybe to that, and then here, and then here. We'll move it around. And I'll just say.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that worked.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is an amazing panel. I was just really struck, Ayuba, by one thing that you said about how requiring labor produces violence against incarcerated people. And the reason I was so struck by that, and I don't know if this is just me misunderstanding, is because I think the message I get about guard violence is so often about prisoner conflict, and it's rarely about labor. And so I just was really, really struck by that just small comment that you made, because for me it kind of something clicked there, and it's not really a question, it's just I'm really interested. Is that a large part of violence against incarcerated people? When we hear about things like solitary confinement, is that happening partly because of resistance to work? And if so, why do we not have that story in our heads, right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, it sounds like I am wrong, but I do think that there's this kind of popular cultural idea that really eliminates labor management as an actual activity that's happening inside. Anyway, I just thought maybe you could talk a little more about that.
No, for sure. That's like a big part of the veil, right? That's what they keep away from the general public to help garner support for prisons. Like to say, oh, they're animals. Look, they're fighting. We have to put them in the hole. No, a lot of people go to the hole because they're not working, or because they have a combative argument with a correction officer over anything. You know, it could be a correction officer having a bad day. But the fact that their sole purpose there is to maintain the labor force.
Yeah, we'll read one, and then we'll come here, because I saw your hand.
Okay, so this question is from John, and his question is, as an immigrant who left South Korea as the Park dictatorship took hold, I see incarceration as a tool of repression. Could you comment on Can you comment on the way in which prison labor masks the injustice of mass incarceration targeting non-white people?
Well, I'll jump on that. You know, we have to look at where policing came from, right? Policing came from, here in the United States, came from a point of they needed to figure out something to do with all of the people who were freed slaves, who had idle time, right? And then two, they wanted to return slaves. The people who were freed, the slave owners didn't give them their freedom fully. They wanted to return slaves. So all the slaves that were freed, they would return them back down south, right? And that was the police. The police from the north would return them back down south. So it's part of the process, right? Policing, it starts with policing. In order to get someone incarcerated, it has to be the structure of police. Then the structure of the incarceration. So it's all entwined together.
And if I can just jump into that one real quick. And we also think about the punitive turn in the mid-20th century, where coming out of the civil rights movement, we see this really huge influx of funding that goes to police, prisons, and surveillance as a way to repress more radical movements. So it should not be a shock to anyone that there are people still like Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's been incarcerated for 40, almost 50 years in Pennsylvania, who was an active member of the Black Panthers. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that people like Leonard Peltier, who's been incarcerated since the mid-1970s, who's part of the American Indian movement, is still locked up, right? So there is a repressive force of putting down any sort of movement against the state, and that's why we see all the time, and I'll stop here, is when we see things like Black Lives Matter or defund, and police are, going into the cities. The main thing, if you look at the images, the police are there to protect Capitol, which is why they set up, guards around CVS and other products, right? It's not there to protect the people. It's there to protect Capitol. So am I calling people out or yes.
Yes, Mendes. Thank you, professors. My name is Mendes Toussaint, and
Could you please speak in microphones?
sure, Mendes Toussaint. I am basically the student of a slave. Actually, my great grandfather was a slave here, so I am really the product of slavery. And I want to thank you guys very, very much, professors. But Professor Thomas, and I want to thank you mostly in regard, I'm a unionist. I believe in union. I teach, but I'm a big activist. But when it comes to union, you said in 1979, 77. Oh, thank you. It's a little bit weird. But you said the Supreme Court rejected the idea of prisoners somewhat grouped together so they can, for negotiations and so forth. So I thank you for that because I had no idea. My next question basically is, I want to thank you for that, but my next question is for Professor Thomas. You've mentioned the right to refuse as a prisoner in prison. Who selects who can work, who cannot work, and how does that work? Basically, I thought it was people would choose to work if they want to. If they don't want to, they don't have to. But how does that really work? That's my second part of the question. I'm sorry about the...
No worries. We just want to make sure everyone heard your question.
We found out that, well, I mean, from my own personal experience, I know there's a committee. Like when you go into prison, there's like, I guess they're seeing your aptitude or what you can do, your education level, all of this stuff is, and also like your status, because certain jobs you have to leave, you need clearance to leave, and if you have a certain level of criminality, they don't let you, leave the facility or partake in some of those jobs. But there's a committee which usually is probably like one of the DEPs, the DEPA security, to make sure everything is going with security, DEPA programs, and then superintendent or superintendent's assistant, and they would actually, just choose the job, based on one, facility need, and then two, like I said, like a person's expertise. If they were if they had computer literacy, they would put them in a clerk's office or something like that, or they would have them help with the education department, or I was a facilitator for ART anger management, because of my education level. So it's different ways that they choose for you, but then like Calvin said, there's sometimes when you choose, the benefits of the job are, one, you get movement. You get to move around the facility, which means that you're able to make deals and stuff. You go to the kitchen, you can get extra food, you can sell plates. So it's similar to the way the world works. Like you're gonna be tested on your strengths and your weaknesses, and then sometimes you're not gonna be placed with your strengths and your weaknesses. We just need a slot filler.
Can I just go back to some comments you made, Calvin, the last ones you made, because I was reflecting on this, you're mentioning the Supreme Court decision again. It was one of a number of Supreme Court decisions in the late 1970s that really put a cap on the prisoner rights movement. It was really brutal. They came down one after the other. And that legal space had been opened up by jailhouse lawyering in the course of the 1960s and 70s. And all that was left after the Supreme Court decisions were individual cases. So you could work in your individual case and be a jailhouse lawyer, or work with a jailhouse lawyer on that, but not collective rights. The state, the Supreme Court, had stepped in and put the kibosh on the collective rights. And so what we've seen in the last decade or so with this new movement, this new prisoner rights movement, if you like, it's not being waged on the basis of civil rights, it's being waged on the basis of human rights. And that's where this slavery issue is absolutely central, because the US is an outlier in this respect, as in so many other respects when it comes to international law. especially human rights law. Abolition of slavery is the abolition of slavery without exception, except in this country, because the 13th Amendment says it isn't. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, and it has generated a whole new round of litigation, which is interesting, and we cover that in our book, because in a lot of the states where they've passed constitutional amendments abolishing slavery without exception, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed on the cell block. And so prisoners have had to step up as plaintiffs and fight the right to have these constitutional amendments enforced through the courts. And that's hand-to-hand combat, which has been very costly, very laborious. And that's one of the reasons why in New York State we decided we had to go the legislative route, which we're currently doing with 13th Forward, pass statutory legislation, not just to abolish slavery, but also to institute fair wage provisions and other OSHA provisions and other parts of the standard labor package. And that's on the basis of human rights, not necessarily civil rights, if that distinction makes any sense.
Up front.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming here to discuss these important issues in your book. I was reading, and this was several months ago, I think I was reading an article in ProPublica about prison labor, and I was surprised to find how extensive it really is. And for example, there are many like Fortune 500 companies that use prison labor. But you know, John or Jane Q. Public doesn't really read ProPublica, but there are a lot of people who, if they knew, they would find some kind of way to protest or register their dissatisfaction or disapproval with prison labor. Do any of you have any strategies for how to educate the more general public so that they know about this hidden oppression?
Well, here in New York, we have Corecraft, right? And Corecraft that's our industry, and other states have their own industries. And a big problem with the United States is that we're very hypocritical. We've shunned other countries for we don't purchase products that was made by prison labor within other countries, but we do that in our own country. A lot of the Corecraft stuff doesn't go out to the general public. It just, stays, I guess, within the state.
It could be very much the seats that you're sitting in right now.
Because this is the general public, but this is like a state institution, CUNY, a SUNY state. So we make those chairs. We make those tables. We just have to, it's just something that has to be, put out there and discussed. And that's why we wrote this book, to not only speak of the labor conversation, not only speak of the 13th Amendment, to abolish that, but just to bring up all of the different nuances that create this prison system that makes it run on, like a clock, on all the gears. Once the gears start spinning, it's gonna keep running. And even if you remove one gear, sometimes it'll still run, it'll still work. So we just have to notify all the gears and get you on board to start, popping out pieces.
and if I could just say real quick to the Corecraft, a couple of years ago there was a movement by students known as the CUNY for Safety and Abolition movement, and at Hunter specifically, they were trying to get Hunter to stop buying from Corecraft. And what we learned, because I was helping or working with those students who were really taking the lead on that, is that Corecraft has this thing called, the New York State Constitution basically says that Corecraft has right of first refusal. So what that basically means is that, say they need new desks, CUNY has to hear Corecraft's bid first. So for, let's say, whole numbers, Corecraft saying, well, we'll sell you those desks at $20 a piece. And then they go to Staples, and Staples says, well, we'll do it for $19.50. CUNY has to go back to Corecraft and be like, well, they're going to do it for $19.50. And if it's being done by free labor, Corecraft can be like, go down to $15, because for them it's all generated revenue. And then obviously places like Staples can be like, well, we're now losing money. So it's a really insidious way. So like, if we want to change it, it has to go through like actually like amending the state constitution.
Can I just add on the topic of corporate use of prison labor? It's actually much less than is sometimes imagined in the public mind. There are only about 2% of incarcerated people nationwide are working on private corporate contracts. And they were private contract labor was reintroduced in the 1980s as a way to stop corporations going offshore. They said, why don't you use our prisoners instead? To put it bluntly. But in fact, it's much less prevalent than you would think. And in many states it's banned, in New York State being one of them. And we were interested in why corporations wouldn't avail themselves of this discount labor and free labor in many southern states especially. They have to pay minimum wage, first of all. And there are considerable logistics efforts involved. If you've ever been in a prison, you know how easily things are shut down, security lockdown, and if people can't get to their workplace, that's a big problem. So there are all sorts of logistical problems involved in using a prison workforce, and then there's a taint of being associated with prison labor. Which is something that a lot of corporations are very leery about. You know, Victoria's Secret was accused of using prison labor 20 years ago, and they stopped almost immediately, but the taint still exists in the public mind, believe it or not, and it's very difficult to get rid of that, that taint. So it's interesting why they don't use more of it. Kathy Hochul was trying to bring it back to New York State. That was one of her campaign pledges when she came into office, and the state labor movement really organized, militated against it, and along with 13th Forward, and shut her down.
That's a good way to censor a meeting. Three things. One, public school and private schools are designed to feed into, deliver bodies to the prison by passing people on. I guess you're not going to like what I'm going to say. Okay. That being said, I've coached kids. I've noticed the policing at sports events. It's ridiculous. I've actually watched where, and you know how teenage girls scream and at each other, cheering each other on. I watched the guard tell them stop screaming for their teammate while it attract me. But that's the behavior. But going on forward, I also believe that the prison is also designed like the public school to deliver people back. There are trades that you will learn behind the walls. If you, for whatever you did, you may have committed armed robbery, but you behaved yourself and they put you in the kitchen, they found out you can cook. But when you're paroled, you're not allowed near sharp objects, so you can't get a job. So what do? You wind up back inside. That's a perpetual thing. You can answer that. But another thing in reference to the ma'am that was asking about the businesses, the minority and women-owned businesses are hurt by that policy of New York State, because the lower price will be, the bids will be bid out. And let's say, for example, you're from the hood, say, look, I'm gonna do good, I'm gonna hire these guys because keep them off the street, and I make furniture. I can't win. So we need to fight this way. we need to really organize this and cut this out. So, I mean, if you can talk to that, because again, like I said, I've been watching that. Every time, if you got kids come out, they can't be barbers because they're not allowed near scissors.
Something really, really strange that's happening is exactly what you're saying. So say like in Alabama, there's this documentary out recently where they had people who they ship people out to go work at McDonald's. They, you know, like just you know, other regular jobs, and they maintain these jobs, have good rapport the whole time on these jobs, have the training, have the capability, because they clearly have these jobs the whole time they're incarcerated. But when they get released, they can't go work at these jobs because they have felonies. Forest fighters. They have people who are currently released from prison, and they're called CMS workers, right? And they work along with the schools, and they're supposed to be the intermediary between the children and the community and the police. They do the same things that the police do, but they don't get the police's credentials. They don't receive the same pay that the police receives, or someone else who's not formally incarcerated that has this job. So a big part of we don't really say a push for it so much in the book, but a big part of the push of this labor issue of paying people a fair wage, of giving people dignity, also comes with the training. Right, so if people were to have substantial training or official training and have certificates and have licensors when they release from prison, then it'll make it a lot easier for them, and they won't have to return. So this is all part of that dignity, you know, like you're getting paid for the work, and you're also getting compensated as far as like you know, skill and experience. You know, you can use this now on your resume.
Can you add just that answer?
Can we?
I just want him to add this in the answer. New York City's body shops for the cars, every car that's a city-owned car goes out of upstate to get repaired. Nobody can bid on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's prison work. That guy gets a certificate, but when he comes home to Brooklyn, he can't find a job.
Right.
It's not an official certificate.
Even in your job, the job that you
Mike,
did
Mike,
was in the optics
Mike.
shop. The optics shop in Wallkill, highly skilled work, making glasses. We only know of one person, right?
Yes.
Who's come out of there and gone into a job in the optics industry in the free world, and everywhere else you hit the glass ceiling of the glasses industry in a way, because of your record.
Yeah, for
so
sure.
it's a disqualification. Actually, it's not a qualification. It's a disqualification to have done that work in prison.
So don't I don't want you to get me wrong. There are certifications and licenses, but it's extremely hard to get it. Like he was saying, I work for the optics at Walk Hill. We produce maybe 1,500 pairs of glasses a day, and that's for the whole state. That's so for any city worker, any state worker, and any Medicare, anybody who's on Medicare. We had contracts with schools, charter schools in Philadelphia and other parts of Pennsylvania, and we produced a shit ton of glasses, but not really getting paid. Even though we were getting paid like what the top dollar was in prison, 65 cents an hour, and then we made a bonus, so it was like double that, so it was 130. But that still was not, you know, adequate enough compared to what someone who would be doing the same work on the outside is. And we did it at we got accommodations like for the group that I work with, because we did it like in a spectacular measure. Like we did it better than any other group that came in there and did that. But we, like Andrew said, is very unlikely for me to have come home and to go get a job at an optical shop or go get a job, because I have a A1 felony, right? So I have a violent crime. So there's certain things that people with violent crimes are barred from doing. I was fortunate from because of my ties and the work that I did within a prison and the rehabilitation I did of myself in a prison, when I came out of prison, I was granted something called a certificate of relief. And that lifts those bars, right? So the crime that I had, I couldn't work in a home. I couldn't work in a nursing home. Couldn't work in hospitals. Couldn't work in a bank. Couldn't work in most financial institutions and things of that nature because of a crime that I did years ago, a crime that I rehabilitated myself for. You know, like I did my time, and I still was being subjected to the label of being that criminal, right? And so what happens long story short, I was with the optic program, I was able to get my ABO, which is American Board of Optometry. So I was a licensed optician leaving, but even with that, it's still difficult, and people weren't trying to pay me the fair wage.
With that said, I know we're close to time, so I want to be cognizant of people's time. So we have 2 more questions over here I want to get to, so maybe like 30-second question, and then they can respond, and then we can open it up to the next portion of the, right? Is that where we're at? Yeah, okay.
So I had a question, I forget who mentioned earlier, I think you touched a little bit on unions and how they played sort of within the prison abolition space, whether contradictory or not. And I think as a student of the labor movement here at CUNY, I think more and more you sort of understand the contradictions that the labor movement works through, whether it's on immigration and all these topics of coming around on what some would perceive the right side. So I'm just curious, how has you don't have to name names or whatever you're comfortable with. How have unions really, how have they been receptive to the current campaigns that you have, right? And or what are the gaps and challenges, and what do you see if there are any opportunities at all? And just to be real, like real talk, like what is it that are the challenges that you're dealing with?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we've answered some of it. There are locals, of course, who are involved even in 13th Forward and nationally, and also in California, where the most recent effort to pass an amendment failed. That had as much to do with finances as anything else. It takes up to $30 million to fund a successful constitutional amendment in California or New York, and where do you start raising that kind of money? But I would say that that's one of the reasons why we called the book Abolition Labor, because we really wanted to talk to audiences like this, labor audiences, and try and help mobilize the support of the labor movement, because the labor movement doesn't automatically see this as an issue, as a labor issue, incredible as it may sound. It's a criminal justice issue. It's a different silo, and we're all in the business of bridging those silos. And you can speak to abolitionists and labor people at the same time. We have to move forward with that in mind.
Yep.
Hello, my name is Skylin. I'm taking a mass incarcerations class, and one of my questions is, it probably sounds Gen Z, like so much, but how do you think shows like 60 Days In and Beyond Scared Straight can affect the prison system and also affect viewers at home?
I have an answer if you want me to go real quick. I hate those shows, because to me they're a voyeurism that are all about content and not substance, right? And so they're about generating views. They're not really about getting to the heart of the problem. One of the other ones that I'm gonna shout out here is that other one that's like Love and Lockup or something, right? Where it's like someone meets someone on the inside, and then it kind of follows their romantic journey, and then they all have pretty much the same arc. The person gets out and breaks up with the person, right? So there's a depravity there, but there's also this kind of stereotyping, like, oh, they were just being used, and whether they were being used or not, but those shows are terrible. I also just think the Scared Straight model is a horrible model, right? This kind of fight or flight mode that you're putting people in, because it just reaffirms this idea that people who are in prisons are these monsters, right? And not understanding that this is a a gimmick in some ways that they're playing to sell the show, or being actually coached to do that to people. Yeah, I could say more, but I'll stop as I know time and I know y'all.
Real briefly on to add to that, those shows are just shows. It's entertainment, right? And it kind of takes away from the severity of this complex of mass incarceration and what it does to communities and how it shapes the future that we have. So it's kind of sad that, you know, people feed into that, and then it also produces like a lot of stereotypes, like Calvin was saying, that they're not even stereotypes, they're just not truths, they're just falsehoods. And people go into prison, you know, people live a life and expect that prison is gonna be this life, and it's definitely not that life. You know, and it kind of plays down what prison really is.
So with that being said, if we can just give Andrew and Ayuba another round of applause for this amazing book. I know that the CUNY School of Labor has generously got their students books, but you know, it is the holiday season. So if you like the book, or even if you don't like the book, buy the book for someone else. And with that said, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Calvin.
If there's anyone who is a student or alumni who did not get free copies of the books, came in later, raise your hand. Okay, great.